Okay, good morning everyone. So, today we're talking about religion in the 16th century, which I am not ashamed to mention is one of my favorite topics in the curriculum that I'm currently teaching, especially in this country that is full of modernists and people who cannot distinguish the 16th from the 17th century. Now, we have already mentioned before that the struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism was one of the key aspects of 16th century England. The way Elizabeth tried to solve this problem was, at the same time, one of her greatest achievements, and also the deep cause of some even bigger religious troubles that would lead to the English Civil War a century down the line. However, today we're not talking about the Elizabethan settlement, which will be the object of our next lesson. Today we are looking at how the situation was before Elizabeth became queen. Okay? In particular, we'll tackle the following points. First, changes in management, meaning how the religion of the monarchs of England changed before Elizabeth. Two, who was the average Catholic, who was the average Protestant, what were the major religious controversies, how these religious divisions, express themselves with physical violence in England. And finally, some conclusion, a list of main points to keep in mind. Today, I will not give you a model answer, and that's simply because I would like to see what you can write without one, okay? So, let's start with the beginning, with how the religion of the English monarchs changed during this period. And with this period, just to be clear, I mean between 1527-ish to 1558, okay? From the first divorce of Henry VIII to the death, the very sad and depressing death of Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary. So, when looking at a timeline of the Tudor monarchs, the first things that come to mind is how confusing and frustrating the whole religious seesaw must have been for the subjects, okay, who were forced from above to change religion more or less every 10 years. At first, it was Henry VIII who famously turned the Church of England Protestant, except that he didn't. He changed who was the head of the church from the Pope to the monarch, and was therefore allowed to appoint bishops and take some other important decisions. He became the boss of the Church of England. But he didn't really make the Church of England strictly Protestant, okay? He had been a devout Catholic in his youth, and for example, if you take a £1 coin, you will see the letters FD. Those stand for Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, a title given to Henry by Pope Leo X, because he had defended Catholicism against Martin Luther, the initiator of the Protestant reform. Sort of. Now, like many others in his time, he did not want to change all the traditional religious practices just to win a political fight with the Pope. He still believed that the way things had always been done in medieval Christianity, in Catholic Christianity, were still essentially correct. There were a few things he changed, like the language of the Bible, like a couple minor rituals, and the suggestion, after a suggestion of his more Protestant advisors, but generally, by and large, the Church of England remained essentially the same, but with Henry VIII instead of the Pope as its head. This was different for his son, the child King Edward VI, for two reasons. First, he was sincerely Protestant, much more than his father. But more importantly, he had Protestant advisors, radical Protestant advisors. He was a child king, and as much as he could have believed something, he did not have the age and the knowledge necessary to think of these changes autonomously. He came to the throne when he was 9 and he died when he was 16. Maybe when he was 16 he would have had some idea, but not when he was 9. So Those advisors pushed him to change the church in a much more Protestant direction, getting rid of all the ritual and theological elements of Catholicism, colored vestments, icons and sacred images, the common prayer book to be issued by the government, and which replaced the old missal, the book with the list of what to say during religious services that Catholics use. Famously, his sister, his older sister Bloody Mary, who was, very important detail, the daughter of Henry's first wife, the Spanish Catholic princess Catherine of Aragon, tried to bring back the clock and take the country back to full Catholicism by cancelling all the laws issued by her father and by violently repressing all forms of Protestant dissent. Also, then with the support of her husband, Philip II of Spain. If you think about it for more than 5 seconds, she was the daughter of a Spanish princess. She married a Spanish monarch. Yes, that's exactly what's going on. All the royal families in Europe did this at the time, and in particular the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria. They do not have a family tree, they have a family circle. It's incredibly entangled and creepy. So, what is Bloody Mary famous for? Essentially killing about 300 Protestants by burning them at the stake. To us, and this is generally valid for all the monarchs, okay, all the monarchs in the 16th century, this time of religious changes, this time in which the Middle Ages give way very slowly to an early modern understanding of power, of religion, of God, of a lot of things. So yes, burning people at the stake, to us, it sounds horrible. But at the time, very few people would have understood the idea that two people could disagree about religion and still be both good people and good subjects. Rather, people believed that theirs was the one true faith, and anyone who had different opinion was a threat to salvation, okay? What I believe is right, what you believe will clearly lead your soul to eternal damnation, okay? Once we understand this, Mary's actions and the actions of all the other monarchs who try to impose the view of the world becomes clear. She had to cut out the cancer of Protestantism before it spread. If she failed in her own mind, she risked losing her reign, her religion, her immortal soul, and that of every man, woman, and child in England. This is something that we need to understand. It's not just religion. Religion was everything. Moving on. Who were the Catholics and the Protestants in Tudor England? Where did they come from? What was the kind of social division between these two religious denominations, or as they were known then, confessions? Much of the old Catholic tradition survived in England, especially in the countryside. Brief side note, and if you're watching this video, you're probably interested in this sort of things. What was I about to say? Yes, there is this idea that England has been predestined to become a Protestant nation, and that is not true. It was not part of a predetermined historical path. Catholicism in England, despite some very important heresies like the ones by Wycliffe, the Lollards in the 14th century, Catholicism in England was incredibly strong. Okay, think of the power of the Archbishop of Canterbury within the monarchy, of all the fantastic example of medieval Christian cultures that came from England. Okay, Catholicism in England was very strong, and despite all the reforms made by Henry VIII and Edward VI, Catholic traditions survived, especially where the government had more troubles enforcing its wills, in the countryside. Those were also areas where, despite the invention of the printing press, new ideas could not spread as fast, and the strength of traditional thinking, meaning things have always been done this way, therefore they are correct, therefore there is no way in hell I am changing anything. This sort of thinking, despite the invention of the printing press, was still very strong in the countryside. Also, people in the countryside loved the monarchs. They are a king, God save the king, and so on. But they also loved to worship the Catholic saint, which was one thing that was not allowed by the stricter Protestant confessions. Okay, the one of the example of the saints is just one of many things that were allowed in Catholic practice and were ingrained in the traditional mindset of these people that would be forbidden. They also felt that the old prayers in Latin, because prayers at the time were made in the Latin language, had something magical to them. And this was particularly true for older people. You listen to this language which you don't understand, but which you associate with the big man upstairs, with God, with religion, with the divine. Many of them were poor, okay, who had been affected by Henry VIII's order to shut down all the monasteries and sell the land to the highest bidder. Monasteries in late medieval Europe provided a wide range of services to poor people: soup kitchens, hospital, charitable donations, and all other things that made the burden of peasant life just a tiny bit easier to carry. Once they were deprived of this monastery, since, as you know, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in 1536, the Catholics did not suffer in silence. In areas such as Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, they started armed rebellions, such as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, which came quite close to overthrowing the new Protestant regime. We'll talk about it a bit later. Most of those who took part in the revolts and who maintained Catholicism during the Protestant years of Edward VI were peasants who had never seen a book in their life and did not have access to the new Protestant ideas. There were, however, also some very cultured members of the clergy, like bishops and archbishops, who really believed in what they preached, especially in the universalism of the church, in the fact, and this was a very powerful motive in the transition from late medieval Christianity to early modern Christianity, that the Catholic Church, the medieval Catholic Church, was the one true church, at least in Western Europe. Okay, and therefore splitting the unity of Christianity, the universalism of Christianity, was a crime, was something horrible, something that damned the souls of millions. And there were a lot of people who believed it, who were able to argument this point in a very cultured manner, who were not only literate but very cultured. This includes several members of the clergy, as we said, bishops and archbishops, and people like Thomas More, one of the most renowned intellectuals of the English Renaissance. You might remember him for inventing the word utopia, for being a friend of the poster child of Renaissance humanism, Erasmus of Rotterdam, after whom the Erasmus program is named. And generally, he was one of the most important intellectuals, not just in England, but in the entirety of Europe. And he was a devout Catholic, to the point that he refused to swear loyalty to Henry VIII's new Church of England and was beheaded. There were also several Catholic nobles, especially those who had family contact with France and Spain and had refused to convert to Protestantism. So, let's set them aside for a moment and let's look at who were the Protestants in England before Elizabeth came to the throne. Now, the Protestantism came to England through its cities and through its many commercial connections with Germany and the Netherlands, which were two very important centers of Reformation. New ideas were spread through books which were produced in commercial cities, like London, for example. And it is therefore not a surprise that the most strongly Protestant areas in the country were the cities in the southwest, especially London. The first people who embraced Protestantism tended to come from the urban middle classes. They were merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, and other wealthy members of the gentry, and they had generally a higher than average literacy rate, and were therefore more receptive to new ideas. This is not to say that if you learn how to read and write, then automatically you will become Protestant. But if you know how to read and write, then your mind is a bit more open to new ideas. And you're also exposed to more new ideas, and you might be persuaded by some of these new ideas. Especially if other people in your same social circle, other lawyers, other merchants, other wealthy and intelligent people, also share those new ideas. They saw the religion of the countryside, coming from the cities, as something dark and superstitious, okay, which had long departed from the teachings of the Bible. Very important point in Protestantism. Sola fide, sola scriptura. Sola fide is something Lutheran, but sola scriptura remains very important for all Protestants. The Bible is the key. This is the reason why a lot of people in the Catholic world don't read the Bible, because for 4 centuries it has not been as important as other things in the practice, but it's also the reason why people in Northern Europe and in America are obsessed with reading the Bible, because this idea that every form of truth comes from the book is a very Protestant and very important Protestant point. Okay, these Protestants, these urban Protestants, were also worried about the corruption and the abuses of the higher clergy. The higher clergy, they flaunted their rich clothes, they did not pay taxes to the king, they were generally seen as parasites. Many of those who came from this urban middle-class background would later embrace even more extreme forms of Protestantism that sought to completely destroy the church and build it from the ground up in a new, different way. We will discuss that, hopefully, eventually, when talking about the Puritans. But yes, many members of the middle classes would embrace even more radical forms of Protestantism and be known as Puritans. Now, during the reign of Bloody Mary, most young people had forgotten what it meant to be Catholic. This is another important point. What you believe is the traditional religion is what you have grown up with, okay? Those people had grown up in the Protestant country built by Henry VIII and Edward VI, and felt no attachment to the old ways because they were not their old ways. They had always grown up in the new Protestant church. And this was one of the reasons why many of Mary's victims were young males, okay, who did not want to simply go back to a religion that they never felt as their own. It was the religion of the fathers, not the religion they themselves had grown up in. There were also several nobles who decided to join the Protestant cause for mainly 2 reasons. The king was Protestant. If the king is Protestant, if you're a noble, you convert like immediately. That's the right thing to do politically. If you want to have more power, if you want to have more influence, you don't remain Catholic. You convert. And then many people converted to Protestantism because they would make a lot of money by buying the land of the monasteries that Henry VIII had dissolved. So no more monasteries. The land is up for grabs. They would buy it and then would rent it out. Okay, so they gained a lot of money by turning Protestant, and that was one of the reasons. Some of them probably also believed it. Now, let's talk about how we've seen a divided country. We've seen where the Catholics came from, where the Protestant came from, who they were. But when we talk of, this is an expression I used several times, of a painfully divided country, what do we mean? Now, while less brutal than in other countries, random example, France practically lost its status as a great power during the endless religious wars of the 16th century, which completely paralyzed the country. Now, while it was less brutal than in France, this seesaw between Catholicism and Protestantism in England could be a rather painful affair. The first violent reaction to these religious changes was a Catholic peasant rebellion, which we call the Pilgrimage of Grace. It happened in 1536-37 in the areas of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, and was caused, historians generally agree, by the dissolution of the monasteries. As we said before, Catholic monasteries were not only institutions for monks, okay? They provided charity and support to the poorest parts of the population all over the country, and they were an integral part in the lives of a lot of people. For example, your brother who usually works the field has a broken arm. What do? Do we let him to die in the field with a broken arm? No, we take him to the monastery. And once we're there, why don't we ask them for some charity? Because one of the people who was supposed to work in the field and earn food for his family is unable to work. And the monks, out of a sense of Christian charity and out of the idea that that's what monasteries were for, to a certain extent, gave them support, charity, and a tiny bit of medical assistance within the limit of medieval medicine, which were studied when doing health of the people. If you combine this, the sudden end of the sort of welfare state provided by the monasteries, combine this with the economic crisis that hit the northeast of England in the 1530s, and you have all the essential ingredients for a peasant revolt. We don't have any more food. We don't have anywhere that might help us in this troubling time. And so a peasant revolt is exactly what happened, which was supported by members of the local Catholic nobility. It was suppressed with some difficulty. It was not as easy as charge the peasants with your knights and disperse them. There is an entire story in there. But it was dispersed with some difficulty by the Duke of Norfolk. However, the key word here is difficulty. It could have easily spread across the country if it was not stopped. It could have snowballed into a much more troubling movement. An example of how it could have ended is the peasant revolt of the 1380s. It never reached that extent, but it almost did. Now, Protestants, in their reforming zeal, could easily be as violent, okay, as shown by the so-called Protestant iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm is a difficult word used to describe any Christian religious movement that tries to get rid of sacred images and icons, usually because they are believed to be against the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not make engraved images, and thou shalt not worship anything else other than God. I don't remember the correct formulation. And so many radical Protestants who, remember, tended to read the Bible and do literally what the Bible said were against icons because they were compared to pagan idols. In Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, where the situation was devastatingly complicated, and we'll get there when talking about the Spanish Armada, I hope, mobs of Protestant fanatics entered the old Catholic churches and started destroying all the sacred images, paintings, icons, stained glass windows, statues, everything they could find. In England, where radical Protestantism was sponsored by King Edward VI, so it was imposed from above and could be done with a certain amount of order and calm, iconoclasm was not as violent, but there were still some exceptions. Finally, the burnings of the Protestants made by Queen Bloody Mary are the most famous case of violent religious controversy in Tudor England. Around 300 people were killed, as we said, mostly young Protestant, in a desperate attempt to purify the country from the heretic disease. These actions and her subservience to her cousin husband Philip II, remember him because we'll meet him again as an enemy. These actions made her widely unpopular among her subjects, even those who were not entirely convinced by Protestant doctrine. So, with this in mind, to conclude, what are the main points that need to be remembered? Meaning, what should you write in your exam answer? First, England was a deeply divided country in terms of religion when Elizabeth came to the throne. It was normal for any European country to be painfully divided at the time, but the constant back and forth of her predecessors made it even worse. Brief recap. Henry VIII hated the Pope, but he was essentially Catholic. Edward VI, Protestant as one can be. Mary I, as Catholic as one can be. You see that this could cause problems to normal people. Second point, Catholics were usually people who had strong attachment to the traditional religion. They came from the countryside and therefore had low literacy level. Catholic rituals were important for their daily lives and they did not want to give them up. There were, however, some incredibly important exceptions like Thomas More, who was, I repeat, one of the most important intellectuals of his century. 3. Protestants. They tended to come from a middle-class background and from cities where contact with other Protestant countries, Germany and the Netherlands, were easier. The invention of the printing press made the distribution and the acceptance of these new ideas much easier. They also tended to be younger and therefore less attached to the old ways. 4. The constant changes in religion caused a number of violent responses, including things like the Catholic Pilgrimage of Grace, the Protestant iconoclasm, the burning of Protestants by Bloody Mary. Now, as always, answer the question, which is write an account of the religious troubles England experienced in the 16th century. And as always, I'm looking forward to read what you write. See you next time.